Hi, I'm James Michael Riley, and welcome to Worse, Stories of Strength and Endurance from the Old Days. Times are tough, but we'll get through this. We've been through worse. Tonight, sitting by the fire, I will be talking to you while enjoying some polenta baked with squash and tomatoes and turkey bacon, prepared for me by my wife. Absolutely delicious. And I'll be having a Coke with real sugar. So if you want to grab yourself something to eat and drink, go ahead. Maybe stop this if you need to get some food. We'll get started. All right. Versailles or the Marshall Plan? Now that's a question that may not make sense to you if you don't know a lot about the military history of the 20th century, but it's a question that represents two very different ways of responding to victory, and that had two very, very different results. At the end of World War I, President Woodrow Wilson suggested a fair and magnanimous plan for both the victors, the Americans, British, French, Russians, and the vanquished, the Germans, Austro-Hungarians, and the Turks, to come to peace once again. Unfortunately, the British and French chose to chuck that plan out the window and create what they called the Treaty of Versailles, which was a plan designed to ruin the Germans financially, to make sure that danger from Germany never arose again. They demanded reparations from them. They took territories from them. They stripped them of their colonies. They stripped them of all but a token armed force. And the result was that so much poverty was inflicted on Germany that the ground was made fertile for the rise of a demagogue like Adolf Hitler. So at the end of World War II, things were done a little bit differently. And let's look at that. Let's look at what the results were. So the main reason that things were so bad for the Germans and the Japanese was, of course, the damage inflicted on them by the Allies as they brought these countries to defeat. But it was also the policies of the dictators that ran those countries right before they were defeated. In the case of Germany, late in the war, Hitler was giving orders that not one resource that could possibly benefit the enemy should be allowed to fall into their hands. Well, as the enemy advanced into Germany, think about what that meant. Destroying the infrastructure, destroying the crops, destroying all the food, which meant that after the war, Germany would starve. In fact, Hitler's armaments genius, Albert Speer, spent some of the last months of the war traveling back and forth from one side to the other of the ever-shrinking Reich as the Allies moved in, countermanding Hitler's orders so that the Germans would survive after the war. And in the case of Japan, they had a militaristic, emperor-worshipping leadership who called civilians who died resisting the enemy shattered jewels, a beautiful term to describe what basically amounted to what they wanted to have be suicide missions. And they planned for their defense against the invasion of Japan was 100 million hearts beating as one. All the people of Japan, as one writer put it, shattered jeweling the hell out of the invading British and the Americans. So survival of the population was not a priority. But in May of 1945, Germany had just lost. There was essentially no government left to do anything or create any policies or conduct any operations. Historyandpolicy.com says that observers reported that the destruction in some of the larger cities had to be seen to be believed. That, for example, in the city of Cologne, 66% of the houses were destroyed. In Dusseldorf, 93% of the houses were destroyed or uninhabitable. Millions of people were homeless or attempting to return the homes that no longer existed. Germany was divided up into four sectors after the war by the four victorious Allied nations: America, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. In charge of the British sector was a British military leader named Field Marshal Montgomery, someone who had been known for his killer instinct during the war, his determination to carry the fight to the enemy. And he said that he was suddenly confronted in his capacity as the person in charge of the British sector after Germany's defeat with what to do with 1.5 million German POWs, a further million wounded German soldiers, similar numbers of civilian German refugees and displaced persons of many different nationalities, no working transport or communication services, industry and agriculture at a standstill a scarcity of food, and the risk of starvation and epidemics of disease. He added, "I was a soldier, and I had not been trained to handle anything of this nature." There was a general working under him named Robertson, and General Robertson added to this woeful account, government in Germany, above the level of the parish council, had ceased. People were stunned and helpless. And what I would add is that stunned and helpless is the state of a people who have been believing lies for years. They were only allowed to see the world through the filter of Nazi propaganda, and now that filter was gone. And now, encountering harsh reality without that filter, they were, as he put it, stunned and helpless. It's a lesson for all of us. Every lie you believe makes you weaker. So, a few months after assuming command of the British sector, Montgomery said, "Our present attitude towards the German people is negative," and that's not surprising given propaganda during the war. "It must be replaced by one that is positive and holds out hope for the future." So I'm talking about the British sector in particular because it stands as something perhaps indicative of or exemplary of what happened in the British, American, and French sectors. The Soviet sector was another matter entirely, and that's probably more than we're going to get into here. But one of the things that the British were able to do during those following several years, 1945 through the early 1950s, was to provide security, order, rule of law, and provision of basic services. Japan's post-war history is less inspiring from the standpoint of what we, the victors, did. Even the official website of the U.S. Department of State says that among our goals in post-war Japan was punishment. And that's not something, strange to say, that loomed very large in post-war Germany. Sure, there were the Nuremberg trials. There were people that were tried, convicted as war criminals, and put to death. But the numbers were relatively small, I believe in the dozens. And please correct me, someone, in the comments or section below if you know better. But JapanGuide.com reports that in the immediate aftermath of Japan's surrender, about 500 of their military leaders committed suicide, and then several hundred more were executed following war crimes trials conducted by the Americans. We were running the country with a bare amount of consultation from the other victorious Allied nations. Now, that's way fewer than in Germany. Why? Given what we know about what happened in World War II, why in heaven's name would there be so many fewer people executed as war criminals in Germany than there were in Japan? It's hard to attribute that to anything other than racism when you take into account the fact that during the war, thousands of Japanese Americans were interned in camps in the United States for fear that they would not be patriotic and would work against our war effort, whereas that wasn't done to any German Americans, not that I heard of. In fact, my German American relatives served in the war. All right. So as with Germany, most of the large cities in Japan were severely damaged. Most of their industry, most of their transportation networks. One website that I looked at said that, and this is comparable to what the case was in Germany immediately after the war. Civilians were on rations of around 1,000 calories a day. Now that's barely enough to subsist on, and certainly that had an impact over the short term on their ability to recover from the damage of the war. People weren't even getting enough food to work a full week. Another shameful aspect of what happened on some of the things that the Japanese civilian populace suffered after World War II was that comfort women, that is to say, women forced to work as prostitutes, were recruited by the Japanese government to cater to the American armed forces. Their belief was that the American forces would engage in rape if comfort women weren't provided to them. Now, whether that was true or whether that was simply a sign of the propaganda that they had been saturated with during the war is something that I don't feel equipped to answer. But what does seem clear is that there are American servicemen that availed themselves of these houses of prostitution, staffed, if you want to put it that way, by women who had been recruited by their own government as a patriotic duty. Quite a shameful episode in the history of America's conduct post-war. So the person in charge of Japan for the United States was MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, one of the victorious generals of World War II. So some of the things that he needed to do, and that needed to be done, were to remove the military as the most powerful political force in Japan, forbid former military leaders from holding public office, reduce the emperor from a godlike figure with absolute power to someone who had more of a symbolic or figurehead status, and raise the level of elected officials in terms of their importance in the running of the country. There's some other things he did which didn't turn out to be long-lasting policies, like break up large land holdings and to distribute the land to the farmers, the smaller farmers who actually worked most of the land, and to do the same thing with large corporations. Now, that went on for a couple of years, and then there was I think was called the Great Reversal about 2 years later, when the country was not beginning yet to prosper. It was still suffering greatly in the post-war era, and it was looking like China was going to go communist. It looked like Mao Zedong was about to be victorious in China, and America was concerned with communism gaining traction in Japan, that all of Asia would go communist. So they did a great reversal, and they put things back in a more of a Japan's more sort of like old line industrialized plan, where there were larger land holdings and larger industrial holdings. So between 1946 and 1952, the United States invested about $2.2 billion in those years in the reconstruction of Japan. Part of what they created in terms of the changes in the government, and Japan's constitution was largely written by MacArthur and his staff with some input from the Japanese people themselves. One of the important things it did was to expand enfranchisement, that is to say the vote, to all men and women. So one of the differences between the approach to Japan, where they basically wrote their new constitution for them, and Germany, where they did not do that to that extent, but allowed democracy to grow from the local level upward, was that Germany had a history of democracy in the pre-Hitler era, whereas Japan did not in the pre-war era have a history of democracy. So reducing the emperor to a figurehead was something that was new to them, but was also of value in terms of growing the country as a democracy. So I read an incredible quote in a book about the Japanese economic miracle, and one could as easily talk about the German economic miracle in the 1950s and 1960s. They did not waste the precious stimulus of adversity. Now it's hard to imagine a higher compliment given to a person or to a group of people. And I certainly hope that if people look back on my life, they look at the hard times and say that he didn't waste the precious stimulus of adversity. And I hope that we as a country don't do that either. So looking back on these two different approaches to what can happen after a war, in terms of what the victorious nations do, there is the Treaty of Versailles, demand for reparations, deliberate weakening of the country, creating fertile ground for revenge, or a magnanimous helping hand that shows respect for the vanquished and leads to a very different outcome. When you think about Germany and Japan, within 2 generations of those horrible defeats, they were our allies, they were fellow democracies, and they were the second and third largest economies on the face of the earth. What wonders can result when the victor extends a helping hand in respect? So for this story, I want to thank Flags of Our Fathers by James Bradley, a great book. Albert Speer, His Battle with Truth by Gitta Sereny, a hard read, but I recommend it. Historyandpolicy.org and japanguide.com. Hey, did you see the Super Bowl a couple of years ago? Rams versus Patriots. There was 1 touchdown. There was no controversy. I didn't see it. But Men's Journal has it on their list of the worst Super Bowls of all time, and its primary offense is that it was boring. So look, we've all had worst experiences like the ones I'm about to talk about, where really all that's at stake is our level of interest. You look at the clock, it seems to have slowed to a crawl. But not all worst experiences need to be horrible, tragic, life and death. So let's look at some of these. So some people consider the most boring Olympic sport to be sailing. There were certainly other candidates on the list, but this is one I think I would tend to go with because I feel that when you sit down to watch the Olympics, your expectations don't resonate with things that happen gradually. And sailing, the nature of it, even if those boats are going 30 miles an hour for all I know, and I actually don't know how fast sailboats go in an Olympic race, it doesn't look fast when the camera is capturing vast expanses of open water. Now, the idea of around the world sailboat racing, that is exciting to me because there's a life and death risk. I'm not aware of there being much life and death risk when there's an Olympic race in boats. So, I looked up this idea of most boring. On one side, I just searched most boring, and one of the graphics that accompanied their list was a still from the movie 50 Shades of Grey. Yes. Well, that is a movie series based on a book series that was written by someone who started off writing fan fiction on a website about the Twilight series. So you're already starting with a not terribly high quality story, and then someone who is not even a professional writer who's just writing fan fiction about it. Oh, let me expand upon the story. And then on the strength of that, she created 50 Shades of Grey. I have watched clips of them, and I found them remarkably unsexy. There's a story I heard about someone talking about a movie back in the 1970s where they said, I've actually grown tired of looking at that person's breasts. And I think that describes the overall sense of the sexiness or lack thereof in the 50 Shades movies. So, watching paint dry. It's a byword for boringness. Well, you can go on YouTube, and there is a 10-hour video where you watch paint dry. It's had 800,000 views. Now, that might not be as depressing as it might otherwise be to people who, like me, are trying to create online content, because I would imagine a lot of those viewers were just like me, where I added to that total, so I guess now it's 800,001, where I just clicked on it for 2 seconds to make sure it was real. It was. It's paint drying for 10 hours. Oh, by the way, there's also a site where if you're looking for something to meditate to, Star Trek background engine noise for 24 hours. So if you're looking for most boring, that might be the one for you. Watching grass grow. There's a guy with a very old school website. Like, it looks like he might have done his own HTML on it as an amateur. That's been up since 2005. That is his grass growing in his front yard. Seems to be a 24/7 type of thing year round. He's in the mountain time zone. And when I checked it out today, the snow was melting in his front yard. So I just saved you having to go there. All right. There's a movie. I just talked about 50 Shades a little bit. There's a movie I saw back in the days when you go to Blockbuster and rent a VHS tape. Here's some of the worst $2.45 I ever spent. The Bumblebee Flies Away. It's a movie from 1999. It's got some famous people in it. Elijah Wood is in it. So this was released while he was shooting the Lord of the Rings movies, which I love, which were gigantic blockbusters. And there's some other famous people in this show too. Not his best work, not on every level, and in terms also of the selection of the project. It's a story of an amnesiac trying to piece together his life. Boring, poorly directed, sleepily acted. The pace is a nightmare, and even terribly edited. I don't know if you've heard of this, but there's a thing in camera work for TV and movies called crossing the line, which is what you don't do. Okay, let's say it's a scene of two people talking. You might have an establishing shot. Here's person A and person B. You see them from the side. They're having a conversation. And then they cut back and forth, maybe between a shot over this person's shoulder looking at this one, and then over this person's shoulder looking at that one, and back and forth as you track your way through the conversation. But there's something they do to help you follow the story. Person A is always on the left side of the screen as you look at it, and person B is always on the right side. Might just be a little bit, but it helps you keep track of what's going on. In The Bumblebee Flies Away, they didn't do that. There were times when it was just two people talking, and I was like, who are they talking to? Did another person come in the room? And that's one of the hallmarks of something that's boring. If something is confusing, it's probably boring. Okay, Moby Dick. is famous for being a boring novel. And I will tell you that the whale doesn't show up till around page 300. So an uncle of mine was in a book club, and the way he described it was, people that in this book club, they would ask us all to read Fried Green Tomatoes or some such. Well, I asked them to read Moby Dick. I showed up the day we were going to discuss that, and the person who answered the door said, "Boy, are they mad at you." Now, I will say this in its defense. Parts of Moby Dick, the writing is freaking awesome, and it's kind of turbocharged. Like, if you just want to search Moby Dick, Ahab Goes Crazy, the description of that is awesome. I read it to my wife once. She said it was like overstimulating to listen to. But that doesn't describe the book as a whole. Okay, Ulysses. Ever heard of this? James Joyce? No? Well, maybe not. It was something that was talked about a little bit more when I was in an English program 30, 40 years ago. Let me put it this way. It's only boring if you're not up to its level. And that describes at least 90% of us. I got up to about page 300 in Ulysses, and I bailed. I read an article that said that there's so much scholarship about this author, James Joyce. He wrote Ulysses. He wrote Finnegan's Wake. He wrote The Dead, which is a really cool short story. He wrote Dubliners. There's an enormous amount of scholarship on James Joyce, but the problem is there's no audience for the scholarship because the only people reading him are scholars. And there's a great quote that I have memorized almost verbatim from this article I read so many years ago. And so, like I said, I tried to read Ulysses. It said, "But even Ulysses cannot prepare one for the ultimate reader-unfriendly, reader-nuking immolation of Finnegan's Wake. It's every phrase a multilingual pun." But before you just decide that you never want to go within 100 miles of James Joyce, I'll tell you one thing I think is pretty amazing. In one of his books, he creates a character who is a Catholic priest, and that priest is giving a sermon. James Joyce was agnostic. He did not practice the Catholic faith or any faith, but he was so good a writer that priest's sermon played a role in the conversion of a famous Catholic writer, Thomas Merton. A sermon written by a guy who doesn't even believe it. Now that's somebody who's able to get outside of himself and create a truly independent character. That's pretty impressive. Delaware. It's the butt of jokes as the most boring state. You might remember the movie Wayne's World from the 1990s where they're acting out stereotypical things to do in each state, and then Delaware comes up and they're just standing there. They can't think of anything. On the TV cartoon show The Simpsons, they're talking about going on vacation to Delaware, and all they can think to do is visit a screen door factory. So I have worked as an actor in Delaware twice. I can tell you that Wilmington has some good restaurants, and I thought it was cool that the Amtrak train that travels in the Northeast Corridor was so close to the theater that it threw reflections on the walls of the rehearsal room where we were working as it passed. So, your call. Oh, I knew a guy who was drafted during the Vietnam era, but he was sent to Europe. His job was that he was sent to a facility out in the forest somewhere in Germany where the United States kept nuclear weapons. So there was a fence around this perimeter and a large area where all the trees were cut down, and there were guard towers. And his job was to spend a lot of time in those guard towers, making sure that no Soviet soldiers came through the forest and tried to take the nukes. None ever did. None ever tried. So I would certainly say that given the titanic sacrifices made by people who served in Vietnam, it's probably a heck of a lot easier to be bored than traumatized and terrified and injured. But he certainly experienced the depths of boredom as a soldier, watching the forest line for Soviet soldiers who never came. Now, I read one list said that night security guard is actually one of the most boring jobs. Well, I think of it, and I'm going to close on a positive note. It's kind of a boratunity. There is a novel from the turn of the 20th century called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. And the author chose to mention a little anecdote about a guy who had a job as a security guard. And this was in the days before electronics, but there were, in the area where he was a night guard, he had to walk the length of a hallway, and there was a box with an electrical connection. He had to put a key in and turn it. And every 5 minutes, He had to put the key in one or the other box. But it only took him 2 minutes to walk the distance between the boxes, so that left him 3 minutes out of every 5. So he studied and got his law degree while he was getting paid to do something incredibly boring. Now that's a boratunity. Thank you for listening to this, and I want to give our thanks to watchinggrassgrow.com, YouTube, of course, and Men's Journal. Now, Civil War widows. Imagine it's 1936. The Great Depression is loosening its grip, but it's not over yet in big parts of the world. You're a 17-year-old girl from a farm in Missouri. You have few prospects of leaving the farm if you were to wish to, few things to get excited about in life. Your dad sends you over to help the neighbor with chores, and he's poor. He can't pay you, but he doesn't want to take your work as charity. So he proposes an idea. Marry me, and when I die, you'll get my military pension. The person who said yes to this was Helen Viola Jackson, and there are 2 twists in her story that make it almost unbelievable. The man who proposed marriage to her in 1936 was a Union veteran of the Civil War, and Helen Viola Jackson died 3 months ago, December of 2020. The woman who is probably the last surviving widow of a veteran of the United States Civil War died 3 months ago. Now, I went into this story, I had heard about it, and I went into the story expecting for Helen to be a victim of sexism, being exploited by an older man in a paternalistic society that denied her rightful opportunities as a human being. Now, in fact, what I'd heard of was a story of a Confederate widow, and that's the one I was looking for. But this story did not pan out that way. Helen Viola Jackson kept her own name. She continued to live with her family. The man that she married died 3 years later, and from what I read indicated, there was never any intimate relations with them. And she looked back on him as a man that she respected and who respected her. He had nothing else to give but his Civil War pension, which interestingly, she never applied for that pension. And she kept her marriage a secret until 2017. But records and an affidavit of a witness confirm that the marriage did occur. It's a tale of surviving tough times in a way that respects both yourself and the other person. And I don't know what I would do under the same circumstances. So here's another one, a little less happy. Irene Triplett died in May of 2020 at the age of 90. She was the daughter of a veteran who ran away from the Southern forces in 1863 and joined the Union, actually just a short time before almost his entire Southern unit was annihilated at Gettysburg. Now, because she had cognitive impairments, she got her father's pension, which she would not otherwise have done as a child as opposed to a spouse. $73.13 a month. And she collected that until May of last year. She was one of 5 children. This Civil War veteran, again, married a woman in the 1930s when he was in his 80s, and it was his second marriage. His new wife was in her 30s, and she also had mental impairments. They had 5 children, only 2 survived. They continued to live in North Carolina, where he was from, and where there was considerable Union sympathy during the Civil War. But many of his neighbors considered him a traitor. Irene Triplett was subjected to being teased by her classmates in school, being called the daughter of a traitor. She was beaten by her teachers. She was beaten by her parents with an oak paddle. She said in an interview in the Wall Street Journal in 2014, I didn't care for neither one of them, to tell you the truth about it. I wanted to get away from both of them. I wanted to get me a house and crawl in it all by myself. Her father, the veteran, who, by the way, used to spend a lot of time sitting on his porch shooting walnuts off of trees, probably so his Neighbors who thought he was a traitor knew he had a gun. He died in 1938. And a few years later, in 1943, she and her mom moved into the poorhouse in Wilkes County, North Carolina. And after her mom's death, Irene was in various nursing homes, where, according to the Wall Street Journal, she seemed fairly content and liked to sit in the lobby, sipping Coke and spitting chewing tobacco into a cup. So she was not a widow, as I said. She was the daughter of a veteran. But it was really not that long before that the last Confederate war widow, now remember the first woman I spoke about was a Union widow, the last Confederate war widow didn't pass away till 2008. So such pairings, one source said, were fairly common during the Depression, where a very much older man from the Civil War era would marry a much younger woman. And it was an exchange of financial security for the woman in exchange for care in his old age for the husband. So I wonder, what level of choice did Irene Triplett's mother have in this match? She had a mental disability of some sort. I would guess that in 2021, we would call some aspect of what happened to her a crime. Well, it's not often that we find living lessons from the historical past in news that came out just yesterday. But I think the lesson, whether you're talking about the woman who has no other prospect than to marry a man decades older than her, or whether you're looking at a man who is a veteran, who has nothing to give but his pension after he dies, it makes me think, let's build a society where no one is faced with that kind of stark choice. So I want to thank the Smithsonian Institution, Wall Street Journal, History.com, and TheGuardian.com for the information for this story. Thanks for joining us tonight, folks. I've enjoyed sharing these with you. I hope you had something good to eat. Hope you enjoyed this time by the fire. And remember, times are tough, but they've been tough in the past, and we'll get through this. We've been through worse. Good night.